Regardless of the attention-grabbing headlines this week, Trump, DeSantis, or global revolts even, we need to keep our eye on SCOTUS because what's still hanging in the balance are affirmative action, student loan payments, election law, LGBTQ rights, and religious rights. It is Monday, June 26th, and this is the 5-minute Supreme Court preview for this week, as they are in the final week of this session deciding upon the fate of American politics and the American people. Let's start with the case of 303 Creative, or the refusal to work with same-sex wedding couples. In the 303 case, which originated in Colorado, graphic designer Lori Smith is expanding her business by creating custom websites for businesses. Good idea. However, she has religious objections to same-sex marriage and does not want to work with gay couples. Bad idea. The snag is that Colorado's public accommodations law prohibits businesses from refusing services based on sexual orientation. Supporters of LGBTQ rights argue, of course, that Smith is attempting to discriminate, while the conservative justices, on the other hand, appeared sympathetic to her case. They approach it from a perspective of free speech, suggesting that an artist or creator should not be compelled by the government to express a message that goes against their religious beliefs. Also on the docket, affirmative action in college admissions is currently being reviewed by the court. The decision could potentially overturn a long-standing precedent that has benefited Black and Latino students, providing them with equal access to education. And when we look at the stats, Black and Latino students are the minority anyway. It's good that they have equal access. The specific focus is on programs at Harvard and the University of North Carolina that aim to promote diversity on campus. Good idea. However, during the oral arguments, the conservative justices seemed inclined to rule against the schools, which would of course be a victory for opponents of affirmative action, who argue that even limited consideration of race hinders the goal of achieving a colorblind society. What they seem to disregard, though, is that a colorblind society will not exist, has never existed, as is evident throughout history. Their decision could set diversity, equality, and inclusion back by decades. Continuing on to the case that's critical for the democracy in the United States, Moore v. Harper is the case that has implications for the future of democracy in the United States. Republican lawmakers in North Carolina are leaning pretty hard on the justices to adopt the independent state legislator theory, which argues for limited judicial review of election rules established by the state legislators concerning federal elections. The theory gained traction from conservatives and supporters of Trump following the 2020 presidential election outcome. Fuel was then added to the fire by the North Carolina Supreme Court, who struck down the state's 2022 congressional map, deeming it an illegal partisan gerrymandering effort. GOP lawmakers came back swinging and appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, convinced that the state court had overstepped its authority. They invoked the Elections Clause of the Constitution, asserting that state legislators should have significant autonomy in setting election rules. Some of the justices, surprisingly, expressed support for the theory during oral arguments, but the case, hopefully, might ultimately be dismissed due to the recent developments in North Carolina's Supreme Court composition. Now, for the sake of democracy, we can only hope that the Supreme Court dismisses this case. The alternatives are simply too destructive to democracy in the United States as we know it. 2 to go. Number 1, religious considerations at the workplace. Gerald Groff, a former mail carrier and evangelical Christian, is hell-bent to sue the U.S. Postal Service for failing to accommodate his request not to work on Sundays. A lower court ruled against Groff, citing an undue burden on the USPS and potentially negative side effects on the workplace morale if other employees had to cover his shifts due to religious exemption. During the oral arguments in front of SCOTUS, there seemed to be a consensus, though, that the appeals court had been too hasty in ruling against Groff. Now, in a not-so-tongue-in-cheek consideration, if someone were to create a work-life balance church, but of course I digress. Last one, the case that affects more than 40 million students and all other Americans in its wake. The Supreme Court is deciding on 2 challenges to the student loan forgiveness program. Republicans argue that the program unlawfully attempts to erase approximately $430 billion of federal student loan debt under the pretense of the pandemic. Conservative justices have, of course, expressed concerns about the expanding power of the Department of Education and other agencies without direct public accountability. So far, Chief Justice John Roberts and other conservatives seemed skeptical of the forgiveness plan during the court proceedings. But there is more to this, actually a lot more, especially as student loans impact all of us, those who carry the loans and those who have paid them off and are in business. There will be an impact. I'm elaborating a bit more on that in the first pinned video. Just go ahead and watch them. So, that's the 5 minute SCOTUS wrap up. If anything, for this week particularly, we got to stay focused on the US and not on other headlines.